Welcome to this session of British Fashion Council's Institute of Positive Fashion Forum. Our topic today is fashion and nature, how biodiversity is moving up the corporate agenda. My name is Bandana Tewari. I'm a lifestyle journalist and a sustainability activist. And I'm saying hello, good evening from Bali. I worked with Vogue India for 13 years. And when I moved to Bali from Bombay, I suppose living in paddy fields and coconut groves allowed me to pivot into being an activist within the fashion realm. I focus on spirituality and sustainability and the interconnectedness of nature and human beings. And therefore, this topic of biodiversity is very, very close to my heart. So here we are. Fashion's role in the climate and ecological crisis is intertwined with nature and biodiversity loss. This session will explore what the industry can do to drive change, exploring biodiversity as a key pillar of the G7 Fashion Pact, and looking at science-based methodologies as a strategic starting point. It will demonstrate how, through a new set of fashion practices, we can restore natural ecosystems and protect our species. We have three exemplary speakers today, and I'm going to name them, but I will leave it to them to introduce themselves in slightly more detail because that's far more exciting. So we have Professor Dilys Williams, Dr. Helen Crowley, and Michael Wessely. Please, let's start with Professor Dilys.
Good morning and good evening for you, Bandana, and all of the audience there. Great to be here with you today and in great company. I'm Dilys Williams. I'm the director at Centre for Sustainable Fashion. We are a research, knowledge exchange and education centre based at University of the Arts London. And what we do is we explore design that puts earth and equity front of mind. So what you were just saying, Bandana, is absolutely at the core of our work. So the interconnectedness of humans as part of nature and what we can do to really value the fact that everything in fashion comes from nature, to look at not only the problem solving of the current system, but actually to reframe the system and put earth and equity first.
Helen?
Hi, everybody. So glad to be here on such a topic. It's very exciting that we're talking about biodiversity and living nature connected to fashion. It is the right moment to be doing this, and there's a lot of really important things that we're going to talk about that we can do. I'm Helen Crowley. I'm actually a wildlife biologist by training, so this topic is really my passion in life. I've worked though for 10 years at Caring, the global luxury group, in their corporate sustainability department as head of head of sustainable sourcing and nature initiatives. That's my new title. But all through that decade, we've been trying to figure out ways that we as a company and through our brands and through our supply chains, we can drive positive outcomes, not just doing less bad, but really working towards positive outcomes for nature, for climate, and for people. So we'll talk about that a little later. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Michael.
Hi, great to be here. I'm co-founder and chief operating officer of Sheep Inc. And for those of you who don't know Sheep Inc., we are a regenerative merino wool knitwear brand. And when we started not too long ago, we took a long and hard look at the fashion industry and wanted to understand its impact and role within the climate crisis. And I guess the way we approached the problem was twofold. First of all, what can we do as a brand to change the traditional model? And ideally, we wanted to look at design, sourcing, supply chain management, really challenge everything and see how can we have a positive impact on the planet and be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And the second question that we ask ourselves is also, how can you involve customers on this journey? Because I think fashion has been so intransparent for so long that we as customers have a little bit lost touch with where things come from, and also the impact of the story of the items we buy. So we are not really conditioned to ask questions, walk into a shop and understand where things come from. And that's what we are trying to tackle. And I'm sure we're going to talk a bit about it in the session.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm going to start off with a question that's addressed to all three of you. And perhaps, Helen, you can start off. And here's the question. What work are you each individually doing that is focused on protecting and restoring nature? I mean, we would love, as regular everyday consumers and not incredible academics and entrepreneurs, we would love to hear practical examples to engage the audience of what's really possible.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks. Let's just, I'll get to that. Super important to get practical, because to your point, to everyone's point at the beginning of that connection with nature, we have lost that connectivity as individuals, as businesses. We've got to try and reestablish that in a positive framing, how we can really connect to nature and understand it. And in a corporate setting, that's not straightforward, particularly in complex companies that have more diverse, diffuse supply chains around the world. So one of the things that at Caring has really helped us is an understanding from very early on of where the footprint is across our supply chains, and understanding that in fact there are many points along our supply chains where we have an interface with nature, but the most important and significant one, at least for an initial focus, is around raw materials. And so for many years we've been thinking about how is it that we can thinking and designing approaches to make sure that the raw materials we use, whether it's lovely merino wool from Australia or New Zealand or cashmere from Mongolia, that is produced in a way that is respectful of livelihoods and also can drive positive outcomes for nature. So I think there's that very first framing of like, where is it that I need to focus as a company on nature. And like I said, there are many points on the supply chain, but if you start looking at materials, and I will keep coming back to materials because that's really important, is like crafting then an approach around materials that can drive positive outcomes. Now that's not the same as just doing less impact. That's also about driving positive outcomes. So that's a framing that's really important. So we've built that framing into our approaches through our biodiversity strategy and through many initiatives that we do. So there are ways that you can, as a company, focus attention on living nature, on biodiversity, through the way you source your materials.
And Dilys?
Thank you. And just really actually to add to what Helen's just started talking about, for us at the centre, and we've been lucky enough to be working with Helen and has done for a number of years, we start with design. And so design is about every decision that is made that goes into a product, goes into the service, the whole system of what fashion is. And we've created a framework, and it's fourfold. On the one hand, we're looking at ideas around environment and understanding the decision-making processes in relation to nature. The second is looking at society and the social impacts and social justice. The third is looking at how we can be viable and look at the economies involved. And the fourth element of this, of our framework, is about culture. And I mean, you touched on it at the beginning. Actually, we really feel as if it's just as important to be thinking about design as a cultural practice, as well as looking at the informed decision-making and looking at the science-based targets around what it means to design. So what that means in practical terms is a number of things, and we're part of a university, so education is the core of what we do, and that is working with learners across the world, both in the university and beyond that, and we're looking at a lot at lifelong learning, especially now with the times of change, where people at various different levels of their career, in work learning as well as BA and MA. So we actually have a course that's running at the moment called Fashion Values Nature. And that really for us is a really great way, not just of sharing what we've learned, but also learning from the learners. So it's an interactive course, and we're learning as much as we're sharing. And we've also got a challenge, actually. It's coincidentally launches today, to ask people to respond to this idea of, when fashion values nature, what does it look like? And fashion is something that's very tangible. So it's about creating products, as well as creating ideas and services and systems. So that's one part of it. Another really big part of what we do is around literacy. And I think right now it's more important than ever for us to understand terms. And there's a lot of bullshit, if I'm allowed to say that on air, that is taught, and also a lot of misunderstanding. And some of that is not on purpose. And so I think we're working a lot. We've actually been working with Condé Nast to create a glossary, and through everything that we do, whether it's with small businesses or large ones, it's about creating this literacy and understanding of terms. And then finally, because I could go on about all the different things we're doing, the idea of this framework of a new kind of prosperity. We've just finished a really amazing project with a lot of small businesses where they are actually exemplifying what this new value system, where alongside economic value, you're looking at social value, cultural value, and environmental value of design practice. And so we've got a really great evidence base of what that actually looks like. So yeah, do look at our website and you'll see the examples.
I love the idea of I went through the website and fashion values, and perhaps, as I said, living in Bali, we are so in tune with nature. And I love that saying that I am the land I stand on, so let's forget that disconnection, because I am that land. And so I find that very fascinating when we talk about biodiversity, to bring in a bit of philosophy into, because it is philosophical, this interconnectedness. How am I supposed to appreciate and revere and respect other species that coexist, that human beings are not the only ones that coexist? So enough of me. Michael, we're very interested in hearing you.
Look, I agree with everything that has been said, and we'll probably follow up to some extent. When we started, I think that the problem that we saw in the fashion industry in general is that it's just so opaque, and very few people have even mapped the supply chain, to Helen's point. So what we really want to do is to almost flip that model on its head, and rather than looking top down, we really wanted to start bottom up. So we want to understand what's the material we want to use, obviously, but also we wanted to have a myopic focus on who do we source our material from. And not as in very broad terms, but we really want to focus on the specific farms. So for that reason, we're going with 3 regenerative farms, to your point of biodiversity. Why are we doing this? Because those 3 farms are really at the forefront of sustainable land management and the regenerative farming movement. Again, regenerative farming is such a buzzword in the industry, right? So again, one of those other buzzwords. But it essentially means that you work with your land, with different breeding techniques, with different feeding techniques, experimenting with seaweed to reduce the methane output of sheep, for instance, and also with grazing techniques, in order to have ideally a positive impact on the soil, the vegetation, and also maintain the biodiversity on land, protect local species, and as a whole then capture more CO2 in the soil and in the vegetation that is on farm than you emit. And that myopic focus on those 3 farms has allowed us that our raw material, in our case wool, is carbon negative. So it is a certified carbon negative footprint. And very much the same mindset we've rolled across our entire chain. So another massive impact, as we all know, is manufacturing. Again, a lot of intransparency in terms of manufacturing. So we are very close to suppliers. We try to find this mix of partners that share our drive for innovation, for sustainability, and for quality. It's always the Venn diagram of those 3 things. And we use solar power across the supply chain, only renewable electricity. We use chlorine-free treatments, non-toxic treatments. And we knit even with 3D knitting machines that run on solar power for 0 waste. And that allows us to essentially, starting carbon negatively and being carbon neutral across the chain, we have a negative carbon footprint for a product we've just released, which is the hoodie, which obviously we're very proud of, and that is without the use of any offset, external offset. And then the other thing to your question that we do in terms of biodiversity is, I've mentioned it already, we do a lot of research project also on farms and protection of the local species on farms. So we have a 5% impact fund. We donate 5% of our revenues to biodiversity projects that sit on a variety of levels, either focused on nature and protection of biodiversity, or research, or something more societal and socially based and ethically based. And that panel is headed by Professor Mark Maslin, who is the head of climatology at UCL London, and he advises us on how we should use that money. And what is quite interesting, we are very proud, obviously, to have this regenerative supply chain. But I think the second step is something that almost every company could do, right? Having a separate fund where you also try to invest in what's really important, which, to the topic of this chat, is biodiversity ultimately, and reconnection to nature and protecting what we have.
Michael, you've pretty much answered all the questions that I was going to ask you.
Yeah.
Should I drop off?
I'm not sure. I wanted to build on the supply chain one, but let's go. Do you want to ask another question? I can build it in.
Please. I do
No,
have a
I
question
think,
for you.
I think that, you know, we have a lot of these conversations, and it's very hard about, you know, well, it's in this, you know, you've got to know your suppliers, right? And I know it can be overwhelming because supply chains can be complicated and difficult. But look, there is so much knowledge now. I mean, we don't know everything, to Dilys's point. But there's so much knowledge about how, at least to start, what materials can drive positive, what sort of practices and approaches on the ground can make a difference, what sort of traceability, tracking. There's so much there. It's not so difficult. Don't be overwhelmed, I would say, about taking that first step to say, I want materials that can potentially drive positive impact. Haven't got all the measurements yet, but I'm going to get on that road. And that's sort of what Sheep Inc.'s doing, and Dilys's course can show. And these natural materials have a power implicit in them to drive. You can unlock that power of those natural materials through regenerative practices, through sustainable forestry, through the way those materials are produced. But there is a power there ready to be unlocked to drive outcomes for climate, for people, and for living nature, biodiversity. So don't be scared about like, oh, it's also overwhelming supply chains. I think there's a lot you can move on now.
So you guys are so way ahead of me because you're answering the questions before I even ask them. But so for Dr. Helen, the question, and you know, partly you have answered, is like, since biodiversity for common people like me is such a complex topic, and ecosystem damage is so wide ranging that involves oceans and rivers and forests and what have you, how does accountability work? Because it's such a complex range of problems.
It's a great question, right? It's a great question. So let's just talk. Sorry, I don't want to give a lecture on biodiversity, although I love talking about biodiversity. So let's just say the biodiversity is the science word that's given to living nature. That means the skin across the bones of the earth that's living, right? The forests, the grassland, the fish and the life in the oceans, all the living parts of nature. Without biodiversity, soil would be just dirt, right? But with biodiversity, a teaspoon of soil has 1 billion, you know, microorganisms in it, you know. So biodiversity, and what makes biodiversity so essential, it's not just the diversity of species, it's that interconnection. So yeah, it's sort of complicated because it's everywhere. It's like sort of asking a fish to describe water. When you say, because it's just what we live in, it's the air we breathe, it's the water we drink, it's, you know, biodiversity. So what we do is we break it into component parts, and we say, well, we're going to look at species, or we're going to look at ecosystems, or we're going to look at the services that biodiversity provides us, the water filtration, the medicinal plants from forests. We look at those services and understand biodiversity in those different ways. And that's how ultimately we measure our impact, positive or negative. So when we talk about going towards being sort of positive for biodiversity, you've got to start taking some sort of measurement. Am I positive on the soil microorganisms? So I'm making soil richer and more healthy. Am I being positive on the animals that range across my agricultural landscapes? And the plants that are there? Am I enhancing the diversity of those species? In which case, am I using wildlife-friendly practices? Am I making sure that I'm not having a negative impact on ecosystems like forests? Am I making sure that I have deforestation-free approaches and so on? And now, to help us do that, what's really exciting about now, at the one hand, we're hitting these really, you know, terrible milestones in terms of nature loss, with 40, you know, over the last 40 to 50 years, 70% of species on Earth have declined. And we all know the climate statistics, and we could go on. So we're at the one moment we've got, oh, there's so much on but the other point is the awareness and the tools and the understanding that we have now, not just as companies and sectors and individuals, but also at science level. We have science-based targets for nature that are getting developed. We have science-based targets for climate, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We have a task force for climate-related risk disclosure. We have a task force for nature-related risk disclosure. There are carrots and sticks out there for businesses to do things, and there are frameworks on how to do it. And so that's why we're at this really, really sort of crossroads where we've got a good direction of travel. We know where we want to go by 2030 as a sector, as a globe, and we have frameworks to plan our actions strategically, because we don't want to, we can make a few mistakes and reorient, but we need these frameworks that are science-based. And when it comes to biodiversity, science matters so much. Science matters for everything, but because at your particular point of where you are in the world or your supply chain, the biodiversity is different. It's location, 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 location specific. So you've got to know, what do I do there to make a positive difference? But these frameworks will help, and these methodologies that we have will help.
So talking about frameworks, Dilys, as an academic who's constantly interfacing with design students, with professional designers, how do we talk to them about what does this look like in practice? You know, what does it mean? What does it change? Because Helen, you're working at another spectrum, of change, which is amazing. But for students and designers, what does this mean? How do we restore? You tell me.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, the first thing it means is talking to people who are experts like Helen. So collaboration and relationships. And I think the second thing is understanding what is within your direct control and what is within your sphere of influence. So I referred earlier to a project we're just completing now, Fostering Sustainable Practices, where we've talked to a large number of small businesses to look at their design decisions, and we've mapped it against the things that they can control themselves. And there's a lot of things. I mean, a lot of the talk about fashion and sustainability is talked about as a big industry issue. And obviously the industry is the 7th biggest industry in the world, but actually over 99% of businesses are small businesses. And a lot of those small businesses do actually have relationships where they can ask direct questions. They do understand and have direct rapport with the people in their supply chain. So don't underestimate how much you can do as a designer directly. And then beyond your sphere of control and direct relationships is your sphere of influence, and where your things that you influence are influenced by. And that's where you really need informed decision making. So I think it's really important to get the balance right between those things and think that not everything is out of your direct control. Yeah. And the decisions you make around the initial decisions are so important. Mm-hmm. So rather than dealing with the effects of your decisions, if you make good decisions to begin with, good design where you absolutely understand, going back to the idea about the philosophy, that you are part of nature and that this is an interdependency that you're talking about, and decide what it is you're going to use, the preciousness of what you're using. And then you start to realize that something that represents you, represents the values that you stand by. I mean, we do a lot around a starting point of, what are your values? Do you stand up in what you stand up for? Do you design things that you can be proud of? How do you know whether you can be proud of them or not? So it sounds like really simple questions, but actually they're fundamental. And it's starting to change how a lot of these designers are working, how a lot of these businesses are working. And there is a big shift taking place, I think, in what designers in education are doing and what a lot of these small businesses are doing, that in some ways they're more nimble because they're small. But that doesn't underestimate the amazing work that's happening at all levels of the industry. And when it comes to working with designers in big businesses, it's actually the same starting point to sit down. What is it that you value? How can you do something that you can feel proud of? What are the barriers? What's stopping you? What don't you know? What do you need to ask? And as Helen said, the answers are now far more accessible. Right. So that's...
As a small business, I would probably also directly jump in here and kind of pick up a few points that Dilys just said, because I think it's very powerful, exactly what you said, to the point of internally interrogating everything that you do, both from a design perspective. There are a few things you can do, right? Think about longevity, think about versatility, think about circularity, think about quality, obviously, but also from an operational perspective, right? You want to really interrogate every single aspect. How can you be better? And you kind of know you're never perfect, but at least it is a journey that you're on, as you also mentioned earlier, and it's a fun journey. I think that's also the other big driving force. There's a lot of optimism in the space, and I think with optimism and fun, you can actually achieve a lot of things. So again, picking up something that Dilys also said, we as a small business also see, first of all, a close cooperation within our supply chain. So we very deliberately, we try to bring everybody together. yarn mill speaks to the manufacturer to improve processes. The farmers speak to our yarn mill to understand how can they also generationally think about the breeding and potentially improve durability, quality, anything along those lines. But also within the industry, there is a lot of cooperation going on, because there are so many exciting new innovations that are really popping out everywhere in the industry. And the way we're looking at it is that this is the fun part to be part of, right? You want to actually be part of the sustainable innovation and really at the forefront of this, rather than just continue behaving as fashion has behaved over the last decades.
Yeah, which pretty much is, we've always believed bigger is better, more and more. And, I sort of mentor in my very frugal way, young designers here in Indonesia and in India and what have you. And, I think the power of having a smaller brand that is controllable, it's new. So, you plant your seeds of sustainability from the very beginning. As your company grows, so do your sustainable practices. And that is so powerful, because they are starting from scratch, and it's just part of what your system is going to look like. That's going to be kind and mindful. So, Michael, all the wonderful things that you've done with this brand to make it carbon negative. What would you tell younger designers who are going to start on this journey with all these principles in mind? If you could just, what are the 2-3 things that they should start out with, which is going to be within the realm of understanding this biodiverse universe that we live in?
Well, I think one of the things is that it ties into what I just said earlier. There is a lot of excitement of bringing people back in touch with nature, and think about obviously every aspect, but also the very basic aspects. What material should I use? If I use a material, how can I source it differently? Are there any new innovations going on in the space that I could potentially leverage to get a better product out of it? That again scores higher on quality, on innovation, on sustainability. Reach out to other people. I think we have definitely seen a lot of power in reaching out to experts in the field, trying cooperations. We have very exciting R&D projects going on at the moment in the areas of lab-grown wool or similar packaging innovations. So I think you have to think about the whole picture, and then also what is going to use, what's going to happen with the product once it's in use, right? So I think we have to go away from thinking about seasonal trends and really think about a much more conscious wardrobe. How can you design something that the owner will appreciate and cherish, hopefully almost all his life, and also use on a versatile basis? So you can use it not only for work, but maybe also for play. And think about, I really like the analogy always of thinking about the wardrobe as a gallery, where every piece is a piece of art, and you put a lot of value into that piece. Ideally, you also, as a customer, put a little bit of time into it, or to care about it, care for it, and fix it, etc. And the moment one of those items is essentially fell off the walls, so to say, and is broken, then you go out and see, okay, what can I do? Can I repurpose something, or do I get something new? And if I get something new, do the research, and then understand what fits into my conscious wardrobe. And I think that's both a customer's perspective, but obviously it's also a designer's perspective.
Right.
How you can build this up.
So I guess what we're saying is there is no invisible hand in this process, and there's no invisible process in the making of the product, right? Because lots been behind the scenes for so long, and it's wonderful that we understand now the processes, the people that lead to the product. So product is not always king. I think there's people, purpose, processes that also matter. And so talking about that, Helen, given the exemplary work that you're doing with the Caring Group and the incredible influence that the group has in the industry and its commitment to moving up, the biodiversity conversation in the corporate agenda, how can it be pushed further up? And how can this be an inspiration to change our entire fashion landscape?
Wow, these are such big questions. They're so good. I wish we had much more time. Thank you. It's It is moving up the corporate agenda for sure, and that's really the last 2 years. I mean, I remember three years ago being in a World Economic Forum group, and everyone's like, "Oh, how are we going to get nature, the focus on nature as much as we have on climate?" It's like we're the poor cousin of climate, and yet we're so important, nature. And yet now here it is, when we're talking about it here in fashion, but all over nature. What do we do? How do we do it? What bits are important to me? So this is a really important part of it, is having these conversations, because I think it is about sort of unpacking what bits I can do and where I can leverage change. And I think that is, it's partly this sort of self-education, education. It's these frameworks that I talk about. I mean, one of the things we launched as a company was the Regenerative Fund for Nature, which was really an acknowledgement that not only did we want to catalyze the conversation about how do we deliver all these positive outcomes through our materials and material production, but also, hey, we need to still learn more too, and understand more, and work with those producers on the ground, and help build those stories together. So I would say that that is still a really important. We're on a learning journey. Let's acknowledge that. Let's be comfortable with complexity, that we don't know everything, and that nature is quite complex, but there are frameworks and things that can help you make the right decisions about what to do. And let's sort of really show, I was going to say the business case for things to move up the corporate agenda, but let me frame that slightly different to what Michael said. The idea, sure, they're always, we know we've got to have a business case, but I think between the risk and the opportunity, and this, the studies that are coming out to show the risk nature is to business, and the fact that the company's going to be held accountable, I think we're getting more and more the sort of that business case side of things. So I don't want to talk too much about that. What I want to talk about is the have fun bit that Michael, that would be my third thing. The thing about nature is it is absolutely remarkable and beautiful and inspirational and everything. When nature works, it blows my mind. I've been studying nature all my life, and I still see things and I'm going, oh, that's amazing. And so when you get inspired and when you learn about it as a brand, as an individual, as a designer, you can start telling stories. And that will create 1,000 better stories, will create a narrative, it'll create change. So I think what we're trying to do as Caring is to sort of help provide as much inspiration, but also as much knowledge as we can as a brand, to sort of get people on this journey so that we can build authentic stories based in real outcomes, not just, and that we can be re-inspired, and that'll create this positive feedback that people will go, hey, well, why not? I want a material that drives those sort of changes, because that's really cool and fun.
I think that's totally right. Sorry, if I can just quickly follow up on that. Oh,
yeah, of course we must, but I'm going to lose my train of thought, because I love what you said, Helen, about making joyful narratives. But now you're the academic, Dilys. How do we do that in education? Because as you know, Michael, you're having fun with sheep ink. I want to hear later about adopting sheep and what have you. And that is joyful. So how do we put this joy in our education system? Because if we don't do, I'm sure you're already doing it, because if you don't do that, then it doesn't percolate down to the consumer. That joyfulness. I'm so tired of this ho-hum, we are living in a doomed world, this perspective, because it makes us lethargic. So this is where the education is so important. So I would love to hear your thoughts before we get into adopting sheep, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my background is as a designer. I love fashion. Fashion is such one of the critical things about it makes us different as humans. We represent ourselves to each other. It's a social process. It's a huge process of livelihoods, etc. So it absolutely has to be about something that is about joy. And I think there's been a huge shift, going back to what Helen said about risk and opportunity. There was a lot of talk about risk and risk reduction, and that's not fun to any designer. How can we make something slightly less bad? How can you take this off it? How can you do less of it? And that's why we started, when we started the centre, with the reframing. It's like the what if. How can you imagine the world that we could all prosper in? And now there's all sorts of things that are coming to pass, whether it's to do with the pandemic and all sorts of other things that, wealth is life, and you know, the Dasgupta report, there's lots of studies to say that people are realizing that money and the economic growth is not the core of happiness. And yeah, there's a certain level that you need to get up to be able to survive, but beyond that, actually, well-being, the joy of life comes from all sorts of things, and time in nature, there's proof to say that time in nature actually improves your well-being. So we do things like deep ecology, and we'd love to, you know, and unfortunately we can't bring students to Bali, but we take them outside, they lie in the grass, they start by connecting, you know, things that you don't necessarily think about in fashion education. So we use a sustainability education approach, but we also use a design and fashion approach, which is an incredible mix, because sustainability as a discipline doesn't necessarily think about the sort of human level of making it personal, and it does seem quite big and sometimes quite overwhelming. Fashion without sustainability is a waste of time. It's meaningless. It's not relevant. Fashion should be relevant. So you put the two together and you put a curriculum together that involves both of those things. And as you say, whether it's about a sort of philosophical questioning of what do I actually want to do with my life? What does it mean to be human? Which is sort of very big questions, but then making it in a practical sense, because making garments, making them with being in a studio where you've got designers working together and you're working things out. There's a process that happens in our brains, I think, when we're making things that enables us to talk about some of those really tricky questions. So that's what we do. We use the process of making to think about some of these big questions, and we also draw on all sorts of sources of knowledge. And I think something that I've realized in the last couple of years, and you know, more than that, actually, even 15 years ago when I was doing projects in different parts of the world, I was really uncomfortable about my role as a white person and the sort of the colonial system that fashion is and the power imbalance. And I think that being able to recognize sources of knowledge, as you're doing where you are, that maybe has some of the answers that we think that we don't know, that have been there for a long time. So learning in a way that's much more collaborative, that's much more respectful, that's much more mutual. And that's interesting. I'm not an online person. I am the studio person, but doing these online courses means that you can talk to people in, you know, we've got 190 countries involved in one of the courses, and that sharing and mutual respect around knowledge, I think, is incredibly important.
I think fundamentally it's the connectivity that we all seek in human relationships, in how we interact with nature and the environment around us. And I suppose, again, living here, I realize the value of being immersed, sort of immersive experience, experiential, you know, those things that we never talked about in sort of high fashion. It's certainly not me in mainstream high fashion, working with Vogue, where were the terms like immersive and experiential and compassion and all that. And so, Michael, now coming back to you, I'm sure the listeners would love to hear, talking about immersive and to be a participant and co-creating and coexisting. I love the fact that you can adopt sheep. So tell us
Hopefully not the only one.
That makes the brand so human. That makes it so delightful and joyful. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this talk about biodiversity.
No, 100%. I think everything that Dilys said is also very true from a customer's perspective, by the way. I think sustainability has become such a doom and gloom topic, and everything about it's very negatively associated. And it's also, by the way, a lot of marketing, right, at this point of time. So I think you also, for the customer, you have to reset sustainability, and you have to involve them wherever you can. And you also have to make it engaging and fun for them, right? So to explain how the sheep adoption works. So obviously, we believe ultimately what we want to achieve is a change in purchasing behavior. We want people to walk into a shop and really interrogate where things come from, right? Ask the question, where is it coming from? Who produced it? How was it produced, etc. And I think you can do two things there. First of all, you can really provide all the information, right? You can offer up as much transparency as you can do, which, by the way, is something we do. There's a little digital NFC tag on our garment, and you can scan it and you see exactly the creation history, including carbon footprint. But again, coming to the engaging bit, I think if you want to really get people to care, you have to make them part of the story. And fashion is such an emotional industry, right? So we want to use the power of storytelling, and therefore, everything starts out somewhere. In our case, it starts with a sheep on one of our regenerative farms. So basically we connect every customer with one real life sheep on the farm, and you can see that sheep on your tag, you see where it is in Google Maps. And it's quite interesting what happens, because people are really getting more interested, right? And hopefully next time somebody walks into a shop, he thinks about sheeping and it comes from a sheep, and the person asks the question where things come from. And if the brand cannot offer up that information, then hopefully we all stop buying from those brands, because that's where accountability starts.
Right.
Can I just, I was just going to put my scientist hat on, because I love this. I love this whole connection to nature. And I think, you change systems with mindset, values, and beliefs. That's what really triggers change in systems. So we do need this very sort of visceral and emotional connection. But as a scientist, I do want to also say that there is the evidence that that we have to work with nature to survive. It's 30% of the climate solution. The business case is clear that we've got to restore and protect our 60% of ecosystems that are degraded or destroyed for our businesses as well as our lives. So there are now frameworks that are based on science that can help you, as I've mentioned. So the great thing is you have a great a basis, a foundation that is science-based and is business relevant to act towards nature, but you also have this opportunity to reconnect. So I just wanted to reiterate that it isn't just about a sort of an emotional, it is a business relevant and appropriate action to make. And it is around, mostly around natural raw materials, and how we do a lot of our action is around that, because that's where we drive the positive. So just wanted to put that in there as my science hat.
Vital.
Amazing. But it's also a little ironic, right? So here's, I suppose this is going to be our last question, because all three of you got to answer this. I find it ironic on one hand, and in order to care more, just to care, the most fundamental human emotion, in order to care more, you have to be a radical leader. Like, you have to radically change a system just in order to care more. So here's the question. Do we need radical leadership to bring this level of compassion and mindfulness, so that we understand biodiversity is not human beings only human beings pillaging from Mother Earth? So what are your thoughts about radical corporate governance and radical individual change? We can start with you, Dilys.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Yes. We do, but radical is from the root. It's people understanding. So to be a radical, you have to kind of understand where we come from. And I think that change has to take place, and leaders and the kind of leadership is changing as well. It's not just the hierarchical leadership. Leadership as bringing people and working in a more mutual way is I think the most radical change in what it means to be a leader. That said, I think there's a huge push that all of us need to give to governments. I mean, the United Nations work on fashion and sustainability is brilliant, because it does bring lots of leaders together. However, until we recognize that the value of life is more than economic growth, then we're not going to get to where we need to get to. So those radical leaders need to recognize the metrics of what it means to be an economy, the metrics of what it needs of a business. So for me, radical leaders need to make commitment to more than economic measures of success. That for me is what is a definition of a radical.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it radical in the sense that often implies a polemic, one extreme or another. What I'd say is we need smart and empathetic, compassionate leadership that understands systems and the interrelatedness of systems and how you drive systems change, and that a business is just a part of a broader system. So I think we need, all of us need this, but I think the committed leadership can drive incredible things. In our industry, we are poised for more of that. And those leaders need to understand complexities.
I have to raise my hand because I can see.
Oh, yes, sorry, the yellow.
Michael, you've got 10 seconds.
I will make it very quick. I think we do need radical change. That's very important. Yeah. I think the industry just needs radical change. But I would also agree that leadership means you have to empower people within your company to just challenge everything and hopefully find out of the box solutions to improve things for the better. So that was
Okay.
So while we sign
Transformation, yeah.
off, I'm going to leave you with a thought. Here we talk about the monk mentality, which is also talks about Buddhist economy, just being Zen about your existence and being kind. And I want to thank you all.
Thank you.
You've done perfect timing. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you,
your wonderful
everybody.
participation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.